Thank you. We're going to be talking a little bit about 3 custom tools that we've developed at UC Berkeley as part of a collaborative project between research in the Graduate School of Education and our Education Technology Services. There are 3 LTI apps called SuiteC. We're going to be focusing specifically on one of those apps, a gamification app called the Engagement Index. And those of you following the current political climate in the U.S. are probably familiar with Ben Carson, the world-renowned neurosurgeon turned political presidential candidate turned HUD advisor. And I think if we can learn anything from Dr. Carson, it's that knowledge in one domain doesn't necessarily transfer to other domains. And what we're left with is really challenging problems that face us today as a society. They require interdisciplinary teams. They require solutions from engineers and designers and pedagogues and the communication and social skills necessary to work in highly collaborative, dynamic, and really intense environments requires that students develop these skills, and there's nothing soft about these skills. They are skills that we can look at and measure and try to analyze using analytics in these systems. But there's a challenge there too, right? And that is, how do we motivate kind of this self-directed or self-regulated learners when the students are so geared around, how do I get that A? What's the bare minimum that I need to do to get that A? And we're also competing for attention. The dreaded tabs across the top of a screen in an online learning course are this constant exit point for students to move into another space, to exit out of the community. So how do we keep them there, and how do we motivate them to want to work with each other and learn from each other? And one way people have thought about motivating that participation is through gamification, going all the way back to the local arcade leaderboard on a Pac-Man, where you're moving to get to the top of that leaderboard, to these complex dashboards that we're seeing in education and also in gaming, where the leaderboard has moved to global environments where we're tracking and reporting and reflecting on all of the different types of behaviors and practices that we engage in these environments. And so we created SuiteC as an ecosystem to engage social learning and to try to track and gamify that learning in some way. I'm going to pass it to Paul here to talk a little bit about our SuiteC tools.
Sure. So SuiteC is a suite, consists of 3 separate LTI tools that can be used independently but work best together, the Asset Library, Whiteboards, and the Engagement Index. The Asset Library is a sort of multimedia gallery tool. Students can submit content created by themselves, uploaded from their machines, links found on the web. We have code in the background that goes through, automatically processes, homogenizes, and allows interactions to take place. If you look down here, you can probably just barely make out the Facebook thumbs up, an eye, and a speech bubble for likes, views, comments. The idea is that students in the course are able to actually interact with one another based around pieces of content that are submitted. Here's right arrow. Okay. Here's a detail view of a sample submitted asset. You can, this is the interface by which a student goes in, adds a URL to the link, it automatically goes out, captures a screenshot, pulls it in, and a comment box or threaded discussions appear below, and interaction takes place. In addition to interactions directly on the Asset Library itself, the Asset Library partners up with the next tool I'm going to talk about, the Whiteboards view. This is a much more free-form, collaborative tool. It opens up a new window outside the LMS, and through WebSockets, you actually can have many, up to a dozen users editing the whiteboard in real time, and it has a sort of a Google Docs style interface where if you have many people online, they will show up in that count there, and you will see edits people make, adding little free-form drawings, importing assets from the asset library and pasting them in and using text, moving things around, and also a live chat takes place in the right side. So, do you want to talk a bit more?
These are
It's
just some
samples.
examples
Yeah.
that students have created in the course, so you can see the different kinds of design flow, and also this remixing of course content. So SuiteC really is engineered to create an ecosystem of content, curation, and remixing.
Yeah, so the one advantage of the sort of constrained social networking environment that's set up between these tools is that it gives us a pretty small, manageable list of events that we can track and analyze. Things like adding an asset, liking an asset, commenting on an asset, using an asset in a whiteboard, pushing a whiteboard back out to the asset library, etc. All of these are measured in the third of our tools, which is the engagement index. What you see over here is the points configuration. This is set by the instructor. It's customizable. Things like adding an asset, liking an asset can be given a varying degree of points to motivate and both motivate and track engagement in different ways. You can also disable certain activities if you don't want them out there. I think one that's not implemented right now, but is it's not enabled, but implemented behind the scenes, is the idea of disliking an asset, which we haven't actually rolled out, the thumbs down. But but it is the framework does allow for that. You could have an activity where disliking an asset causes both you and the person you're disliking to lose points. So just as liking helps both you and the person receiving the like.
Yeah, and it actually has been used in one course, and it was not used by the students, so they wanted to keep it positive, and they avoided using the dislike button.
Right. The opportunity was presented, and nobody wanted to go there. Over. Should I play the video?
We can probably, we can probably. I think just one other point about the engagement index that's really unique is that it rewards reciprocity and interactions, right? So typically in these systems, if I comment on your work, I get a point or something like that. But in our system, when I comment on your work, I get points, but you get points for inspiring that comment. And so the idea is really to motivate this peer-to-peer engagement by rewarding students that really bring value and bring impact to the learning community. And so we looked at this engagement index in one specific course. It's an undergraduate education course called The Art of Making Meaning. And we looked at it across 2 semesters. And because the tools have been in ongoing development, we'll see kind of how some of the results shifted from one semester to the second semester based on some of these tweaks to our system. But this is a course that's really focused around issues in education and critical literacies. And so it really is designed for students to engage with each other and to be really active learners and taking ownership of the community and their impact on that community. And so each week, the students move through this active learning arc where they do an inspire activity, a curating activity of some kind. Then they explore instructional content. They do research. They collaborate with each other, and they reflect. And they move through this arc each week and produce quite a bit of content in that process. And so what we've tried to do is try to bring more nuance into how we understand how tools get situated in the pedagogical design of a course. And I've been using in my dissertation research the Deleuzian assemblage as a model for thinking through this. And so you can imagine in our courses, you have the technical infrastructure of a course that precedes the pedagogy or the learning design that gets implemented on top of that. These components, and especially in a kind of plug-and-play environment that we're moving towards with interoperability, these components are fairly autonomous. They get plugged in and out of each other, and they get transformed when you situate them in a course design, right? Tools have certain affordances, certain potentials, but they really take meaning and take shape as an instructor situates them inside of a course environment. And so we can map that and think about then as students begin to engage in a system, that system takes on new meaning. Students do unexpected things in these environments. Students can be unpredictable, especially when we're talking about social learning environment. The social is a dynamic and unpredictable place, and it's not always tied to the kind of hard outcomes that grades are associated with. In the keynote this morning, we heard a little bit about some of the critiques and the shortcomings of always being grade-centric. And so how can we kind of think about how we can map interactions across the system to see what emerges in a learning environment, to see those dynamic interactions unfold. And we can trace participation across these various vectors and think about collaboration at different levels of viewing as a more passive activity versus commenting versus remixing and collaborating in a whiteboard together. We can trace those things. We can think about where is the instructor prompting that activity, where are students taking ownership of that activity and moving it in new directions. And so during the course of those 2 semesters, you can see the amount of content that students generated in this environment, creating or curating over 20,000 assets into our library, liking over 25,000 assets, creating over 4,000 collaborative whiteboards, and checking the engagement index over 5,000 times. And so if we look across the fall and the spring semester, it's pretty interesting. So these are the average number of launches per user. And in the fall course, and that was the first semester, we rolled out the tools, and the instructors were quite excited. And I'm sure that they were, kind of pushing the students to interact with the tools more. And so you can see it started off quite hot, and then they kind of tapered out. But at the end, and I should mention, part of the course design here, the engagement index score had nothing to do with their grade. The TAs qualitatively graded. So this was a tool that was just there for the students, but you can see at the end of the semester a spike in those launches. And so it demonstrates that students, even though it wasn't tied to their grade, they were referring to that score as a way to see how they were stacking up against their peers. It was also interesting to try to understand what that elevated amount of launches in the beginning of a semester indicated. What was the role of the teacher perhaps in framing that? And again, this gets back to this dynamic social environment. You can see early on in that fall semester, instructors were launching that engagement index with much more frequency as well. And then in the spring semester, and this is actually me, so I was a TA in the course, and this was more research related. So instructors in the spring semester completely ignored the leaderboard, and yet students were still launching that tool with some frequency. So you can see that it had meaning to them in trying to manage their participation. And they managed that in different ways. So one student, for instance, who was really I would say critical of the course design in some ways, and yet he referred to the engagement index and said, I want to stay in that 50% kind of percentile. I don't want to dip below that. It was an arbitrary thing that he chose, but it was a way to frame and understand his participation. So what happened with the gaming? How did students game the system? This is what happens in gamification, right? Or one of the concerns. And you can see here the total points, engagement index points over a semester, and the competition that was unfolding among these students. As one bounced up in a score one week, it was followed up by another huge bounce the following week. And as we dug into this, we found that they were primarily liking assets in high numbers, high volume, to achieve a high score. And what we realized was that, well, in our asset library, you were able to like thumbnail images of these assets without blowing it up into a full view. So it was a fairly effortless thing to scroll through the library, like all of these things, and accumulate a lot of points. So the following semester, we tweaked that system so that if you hit the like button on a thumbnail, it blew up the full image of the artifact. So you can imagine what happened our liking died. So it decreased by almost 90%. Just increasing the little cost of giving a like totally killed that as a gaming strategy. And it's really quite interesting thing, right? Because in social media, how many of you scroll through your Twitter and you don't actually expand the tweet, you just kind of see a preview of it and like it. And so it's this interesting thing. Was that gaming a negative behavior, or was it actually giving something to the community, right? It was the students that were giving all of these likes were still high performing students. It wasn't distracting them. And now, right, all those people that got all those great likes and were feeling good about themselves in the second semester, nobody was getting any likes anymore. So it's interesting to think about, again, how these tweaks in the technical assemblage change things. In fact, it was so dramatic that in the spring semester, the whole class, the whole semester, only 559 likes were given, and yet that one student in 1 hour on a Wednesday night in October gave 825 likes. So people were feeling really good about themselves the next day after she spent an hour liking everything in the library. So then we got to the spring semester and we looked again at that top 4 to see, well, was there a race? If they weren't liking and gaming the system in that way, what was the race? And by the way, these are always interesting points. Anybody can imagine what point in the semester this was? Spring break.
Oh, spring break.
It dove. Its participation died, man. That was it. Nothing happened during spring break. But there, you don't see, right, the first ranked student didn't have these huge peaks in participation that the gamers had in the fall semester. So it got us thinking, like, so what were they doing? What was happening? And what was this first place guy doing? Like, he didn't have any of these gaming moves. He exploited another crack in our system. So what you could do is, in part of our you opt into the leaderboard as a student in our course. So if you opt in, you can see the scores of other students on the leaderboard. If you're opted out, you only see your own. So this guy would opt in, make sure he was still in first place, and then opt out immediately. And he continued to do that even right up to the very end of the semester, where he kind of gave a last-minute check to make sure he was in first place. Meanwhile, the third place person really thought she was in first place because on the leaderboard she was on first, and this guy was just in the weeds, kind of sneaking around, trolling the situation. So, I feel like this is actually a more destructive behavior than the one that did all the liking, right? Because this one is compromising the integrity of the system, right? The students don't get a fair sense of what's happening. And so we were better off with the woman that was just very generous with all her likes than this guy who was sneaking around in our system. And then when we do a breakdown of that participation, this was pretty interesting, and this gets to the designed assemblage, what I was talking about, how the pedagogy of a course influences that participation. And these are the breakdowns of the first place student, the second place student, the last place student, and the average. And you can see, even though the first and second place did a lot more of those activities, proportionally they're quite similar. You would think that there would be a more diverse kind of breakdown of these activities, when in fact, because the design assemblage has such an influence on how students participate, it gets framed in this way. So the takeaway is that even without consequence on the grade, putting a leaderboard in a course had an effect, and it had an effect in different ways for those chasing the top points or those more towards the bottom who are just trying to get a sense of their own participation. But what about that gaming? How can we kind of continue to think through what it means to be a gamer? Well, then we start introducing more kind of analytics and reports to students, breaking down their participation in a way that they can see more clearly kind of how the community is doing, what's trending in the community. I have an NSF grant now to build a more robust social analytics dashboard where students can really dive into their own participation and see more nuance in their participation and collaboration. And then we've also started to experiment with visualizing some of this data in 3 dimensions. So this is the community of learners and transformations in points over time. And then we got to actually 3D printing students. So this is a student in our course, and it's 16 weeks, so each layer of this 3D printed object is a week in the course. And these are assets added to the library. These are points that they gave out to the community on another dimension, another branch. the points that they received from the community, right? So that reciprocity, who's impacting, whose content is being taken up by that community. Time, which is, a lot of folks use time as a variable. We found that it was not a reliable variable in our data. Students kept a window open and kind of sat there idly, and the system wasn't particularly adept at kind of disabling that engagement. But you can start to see patterns that emerge in these 3D visualizations of how balanced is a student's participation in a community. What kind of a personality, a social contributor are they inside that learning community? And remember that girl that liked all that stuff? Well, she had a broken tree. Her tree tipped over. These are all her liking, all her points out. And so this idea of cultivating a profile and thinking about, am I an authentic contributor to this community? 3D printing and visualizing it in this way was a way to get at, right? Data visualization is supposed to be affective. It's supposed to motivate us to do things. And so presenting it in more aesthetic ways is one strategy that we've thought about to improve how we deliver analytics back to students. Here's some trees, and you can see the various forms and shapes that they take. And moving forward, right, I think we can make this environment much more intelligent, and especially here with smart scoring. What we want to think about next is that girl that was liking all of that stuff, well, what if our system just adapted and started to decrease the value of that participation and increase the kinds of participation in other areas? And so adapting to the personality of the student, to the behaviors of the student, we can create a smart scoring system that makes a more authentic or a more effective way for the point system to function for instructors. So that's our presentation. Again, this is a project from UC Berkeley. It's an ongoing project. And we'd love to hear your input. Thank you.
Time for a couple of questions. I'm interested in your theoretical framing of it. You use assemblage.
Yeah.
Assemblage. So I'm familiar. I do a lot of work in social, trying to engage social communities, and I always conceptualize in terms of Levin-Wenger. If you're familiar with the
communities of practice,
so
sure.
You kind of look at participation, increasingly central participation. And how would that kind of accord with your framing as in terms of technical assemblage?
Yeah. There's definitely some overlap there. One of the things that the assemblage brings in is that it's a socio-technical system. So communities of practice are typically organized just around the people, and it's very kind of goal-oriented. In assemblage theory, right, each component in a system, both human and non-human components, even semiotic components, they maintain a level of autonomy. Right? That's the kind of plug and play that we're trying to build technically, but also you can think about it kind of semiotically or socially as well. And so, again, if we think about it across these planes, that's the other nice thing about the assemblage model. And this really comes from Manuel de Landa's work. So it's Deleuze and Guattari are the kind of originators of the concept. But Manuel de Landa really provides an empirical model for thinking through how to map out, right? Because again, these components, right, these technical components, they become reconfigured in relation to the designed assemblage, to the pedagogical components that move into this environment, right? So again, that other instructor who made the engagement index score part of the grade itself, right? That changed the relation students had with that tool in the environment. Suddenly the stakes were much higher for that tool because it was tied to their grade. Frequency of checking it obviously increased. And so mapping it out in this way and thinking conceptually about these tools and their situatedness in the course design can really, I think, illuminate for learning analytics some of the nuance right? Because if you look at the gamification literature, it's quite mixed as far as the results. I mean, some papers will talk about it really motivating and being a positive influence in a course. Others have talked about it in more negative terms.
Could I ask a quick follow-up to that?
Yeah.
So I'm interested in what would you consider educationally virtuous participation or engagement in this framework. So as you talked about liking.
Yeah.
In my view, that might be kind of lower on the engagement scale than actually participating in discussions, much less really contributing deep and meaningfully.
Definitely.
In a meaningful way. So do you look at that at all? And
Yeah, and
does
it's...
the engagement index include that kind of level?
Yeah. So Paul mentioned that you can customize as an instructor the point value for all the different activities.
So you weight
them, and as an instructor, again, getting to that design assemblage, what do you want to privilege? What kinds of social interactions do you want to privilege in the course, right? So we have, instructors that don't give any points for liking at all. They want to just award points for commenting or for, again, the whole idea of receiving interactions on the content that you're generating is a nice way to, make them or inspire students to contribute more meaningful content.
And then do you look at then the correlation between that and course achievement? Have you looked at that at all?
So that's what we're starting to look at now a little bit. So we're looking kind of, again, in the education course, students, this is not a course that students fail unless they really try to fail. If you've ever taken an education course, they're kind of A-B courses. And so, we kind of wanted to get away from tying it just to these kind of discrete outcomes and thinking more about the process and what are students actually doing socially in the environment. But it's definitely something we're starting to look at. Yes?
This is a Canvas LTI?
Yeah, so it plugs into Canvas.
So when the students go in, or the teacher, do they have to authenticate every time they go into the tool, or just the one time and then it's a part of their Canvas access?
Yeah, it's single sign-on. Maybe you can speak more to the technical.
It's through the LTI protocol. So the student having already signed into Canvas, that authentication is just passed along to our tool that lives inside Canvas.
And we actually do reward and track participation in the Canvas discussion tool. So we're actually pulling data from the LMS itself and activities engaged in the LMS and reporting it back into the engagement index. So we have a really seamless relationship, the SuiteC tools, with the Canvas LMS.
There's also an option to sync up the asset library, that gallery view, with assignments submitted through Canvas. Certain assignments can be flagged to just if it's the sort of assignment where you submit a file, it can just get pulled over into the asset library and become part of the tool.
Has anybody ever thought of also doing some semantics on the discussion comments and putting it in there?
Oh yeah. So in another course where the commenting points were bumped up, the gaming strategy there was a one-word comment followed by an immediate reply and then building sentences in multiple comment levels to get lots of points. So but to get at the qualitative nature of the comments would be a really powerful, aspect to introduce into the tools, and it's certainly something that we would love to explore.
One more question?
Yeah.
This sounds like a comment, like I'm not making a serious comment, but I am. Did the students learn something about the design of these systems from this? I mean, did you? Because it seems to me they must have learned a lot about your designs and how you were thinking about it.
Yeah, and especially in an education course, there's always this meta aspect to educate, right? You're like learning about education while you're being educated, and so
the game is really not only can you fix this, but can you outthink the person who's designing it? So that means they're engaging with you in a debate about this technology. It seems to me quite interesting.
There is, and again, I think as far as dashboards and trying to prompt this metacognitive behaviors, right? Metacognitive reflection, like who am I as a learner? Who am I in a community? And it has really profound, I think, potential because I think that the data is pretty strong that when students feel that they're a part of a learning community, when they feel that they're a valued member of a community, community, that they are going to be more engaged. They're going to participate in it more. And then you will see, you know, those ties to the more hard outcomes like grades, I think, especially for students from non-dominant backgrounds that, you know, that kind of remain on the periphery of some of these communities. How can we leverage these social analytics to fold them into the community, to find opportunities to validate their voice in a learning community is a really powerful, I think, proposition for how learning analytics can make our learning communities more inclusive.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.